Welcome, everyone, to the series Facing Inequality. I'm James Foster, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, at the George Washington University in our nation's capital. It's a special pleasure being here with you for today's event, How the Pandemic Exposed the Incomplete Gender Revolution, Work, Family, and Public Policy, with Betsey Stevenson of Michigan's Ford School. I want to thank Professor Stevenson for taking time from her incredibly busy schedule to discuss this important topic, whose relevance is only amplified by the recent op-ed by Vice President Kamala Harris entitled "The Exodus of Women from the Workforce is a National Emergency." We also have two tremendous discussants, GW sociologist Eiko Strader and GW professor of public health, Mary Ellsberg, who is also the executive director of GW's Global Women's Institute. The moderator for today's presentation is Jay Shambaugh, co-director of IIEP, who, like Professor Stevenson, served on the Council of Economic Advisors under the Obama administration. Thank you all for being here. Today's event is being co-sponsored by the Global Women's Institute, the Departments of Economics and History, the GW Interdisciplinary Inequality Series, and GW Women in Economics, a student organization founded by two of IIEP's student staff members to increase women's representation and support women's participation in economics at GW and in the broader profession. I want to thank all these organizations and IIEP's own executive circle with co-chairs Deborah Lair and Frank Wong for their loyal support. Now, for those of you who've never attended an IIEP event, either online or in person at the Elliott School of International Affairs, you can expect an informative and nonpartisan exchange of views on topics like digital trade, global governance, and US-China economics relations. Our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series recently brought Sir David Hendry to IIEP for a masterclass on the past and the possible future of climate change. Last October, Carmen Reinhardt initiated our China conference series with an amazing tale of global debt. And next week, our Envisioning India series will present a panel discussion on the farm laws with Mahendra Dev and Kaushik Basu. You can catch these and our other videos on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Today's event is the 11th in our Facing Inequality series, which began last May with economist Branko Milanovic. The idea for today's event with Professor Stevenson began as an email from Maria Cueto, Scholarship Director for GW Women in Economics, and her professor, Irene Foster, an IIEP affiliate who I am most familiar with. I thank them for their great suggestion. In just a moment, I'll ask GW historian and IIEP affiliate Trevor Jackson to say a few words about the series. Then we will turn it over to Madeline De Chiak, president of the GW Women in Economics and IIEP staff member, and a student of both Professor Foster's, to introduce our speaker and discussants. But first, I wanted to mention that Professor Stevenson has just released an innovative new principles text with a certain Professor Justin Wolfers, a text that's designed to inspire students, address a more diverse population, and anchor their understanding through intuition. Thanks to both of you for this public good. Now over to Trevor Jackson, an expert on crises and inequality throughout history, to present the series. Trevor?
Great, thank you, James. I hope I'm audible now. I'm pleased to be able to speak on the goal of this series, which began in the before times, and a conversation between myself and Brian Stewart of GW's economics department. Now, normally conversations between historians and economists, when they happen, tend to focus on our methodological differences, but Brian and I realized that one thing that we shared was a sense that inequality was one of, if not perhaps the salient policy and intellectual challenges of our time, and something that intersected with many of the other subjects that we and our colleagues find compelling. So we decided to form a group funded generously through the GW Interdisciplinary Seminar Series, which was an interdisciplinary series on inequality that would bring together historians, economists, other people interested in inequality to perhaps create a common language across our disciplinary boundaries. With the outbreak of the pandemic last year, James Foster and IIEP has kindly provided a sort of digital home for us and an expansion of the audience. As he says, this is our 11th talk in the Facing Inequality series. And I think a quick run through the sort of topics that we've covered will give you a sense of the interdisciplinary approach. We have heard from Brooke Ackerley on lessons of climate change justice. We have heard from Judy Stevenson, Patrick Wallace, who are economic historians, about laborers in London in the 17th century. We've heard a philosopher's approach to multidimensional inequality with Christy Olson. We've heard about central banking with Benjamin Braun, and so on and so on. We cover topics both in the present and in the past from a range of disciplines and try to bring together commentators and discussants from disciplines unlike the discipline of our speakers, again, in an effort to create a language that might be of use both within academia and outside of it, in policy circles and in study, to try to approach inequality in all of its multidimensional ways. And so to introduce today's speakers, I'm very pleased to turn over now to Madeline. Madeline, take it away.
Hello everyone, my name is Madeline De Chiak and I'm a senior studying international affairs and economics. I've been a research assistant at the IIEP for almost 2 years now. I'm currently president of GW Women in Economics. We're an organization on campus aiming to encourage women's representation, participation, and empowerment in economics and related fields. We are open to all self-identifying women with an interest in economics. If you'd like more information, please check out our website or our Facebook. To join, please email us. You can find our email on our website. Our members at GW Women in Economics are incredibly eager to hear from Dr. Stevenson. Her research contribution at the AEA, National Bureau of Economic Research, and the Obama administration prove her immeasurable influence. We are humbled to be able to speak with her about her work, family, and public policy. From a personal standpoint, to say Dr. Stevenson is impactful in my life would be an understatement. She is a role model for all future female economists like me. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Betsey Stevenson.
So without any further ado, let us do that right now. Betsy, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for telling me so much about this series. I'm really excited today to be able to participate in this series because I think of what I want to talk about is trying to put the economics into the historical context of how things have changed for women over time. And the economics is to try to understand the incentives that have been created along the way that have acted as a force that has contributed to some of this change. So what I want to talk about today is how the pandemic exposed the incomplete gender revolution. And so this is actually part of work that I've been doing for some time on the incomplete gender revolution and the relationship between work, family, and a really patchwork public policy system. But now, of course, we've had the pandemic that I think has really exposed a lot of people who might not have thought about the linkages between work and family and public policy in quite as clear a way as they now do post-pandemic, where we're all sort of wrestling with the intersection of childcare, of family obligations, of work. At the beginning of this session, before we went live, I said, "Oh, give me a minute. My washing machine is beeping at me. If I don't stop it, it's going to beep the whole time." And I think that's that sense of which our lives, our work, our family is completely integrated into what we're doing because we're working from home. But that's not it. This was true prior to working from home. It was just more invisible. And we were able to create, I think, artificial boundaries so that we didn't see these important linkages. So what I want to do today is just give a few minutes on our current situation, what many people have called a she session, why this is so unusual, And then I want to examine how gender roles and families have changed over time and turn to economics to help us understand some of these changes. In particular, looking at the role of policy, technology, and trade changes in the second half of the 20th century on families, and highlight the challenges that people face today. So there's obviously a lot to do in 40 minutes. So I'm really just going to be touching on that role of policy, technological, and trade changes, but really trying to get you just to think a little bit about them and incorporate that into the way in which you see what's happened over the last 50 years. So prior to the pandemic, women had hit a lot of important milestones. Women held more jobs than men. So in December 2019, women became the majority of holders of non-farm payroll jobs. So realize men are still had greater labor force participation and were more likely to be engaged in paid labor, but men tend to do more self-employed work, and women tend to work more for an employer. And as a result, when we look at just who's holding jobs, working for an employer, women were holding more of the jobs. And that was true in December 2019. It was true in January 2020, February 2020, and that came to a crashing end in March 2020. So to understand both why women were holding more jobs and why it came to a crashing end, what you have to realize about the US economy is that we have shifted from a large chunk of the economy being in the goods producing sector. So you have to go all the way back to the middle of the last century, sort of the 1950s, where we see the goods producing sector being roughly half of the economy. And today, the goods producing sector is only 17% of the economy. But in every recession we've ever had before this pandemic, the recession tends to hit the goods producing economy. And the goods producing economy is exactly what you think. It's making stuff. So manufacturing is obviously an important part of that. These tend to be more male dominated jobs. If you go back to the 2008 recession, 20% of the jobs in the economy were in the goods producing sector, and 50% of the job loss was in the goods producing sector. So men tend to get hit more in a recession than women do. This has been our first ever service sector led recession, and women are more likely to hold service sector jobs. So I said you can put this idea that women have been gaining jobs and women got hurt harder by the pandemic together by thinking about these shifts in the economy. So when we entered this recession in March of 2020, we still had 1 million fewer jobs in the goods producing sector than we had at the start of the last recession. And we had 15 million more service sector jobs. And that those jobs were disproportionately going to women. But the pandemic really hammered jobs in which people engage with other people, and those tend to be service sector jobs. And I don't just mean the restaurant jobs. Those obviously did get hurt, and those are slightly more likely to be held by women than men. But even healthcare jobs early on, women hold the vast majority of jobs in healthcare and education, and those are the jobs that tended to get hurt. So that's the labor force situation. Now, let's also think about parenting. Women with young children were more likely to be in the labor force than at any time in the past in 2019. So not only did women hit a milestone of holding more jobs than men in 2019, they also hit a milestone of women with children under the age of 6 had a higher labor force participation rate than any time in the past. Women ending their fertile years were more likely to be mothers than the women in the generation before. So when we look at women in their early 40s, in their mid 40s, they had more children than the women who had than women 10 years prior. So what was happening, and we're going to see some more data on this, is women were having their children at older ages. What this means is that we had more women as we entered the pandemic in their early 40s, in their late 30s, with more children than they've ever had in recent years, and yet more young children than I think women have really ever had in this age band, and more work experience than women had with young children. So you have these women who are, say, 35 to 4 years old, with many children under the age of 10 at home while they're trying to also work. One final point, which you'll see in a graph, is that women had led the increase in labor force participation following the 2008 recession. So all the recovery we saw really in labor force participation was primarily coming from women. We saw some from men, but women's recovery was much stronger than men's. So as that pandemic hit in March 2020, the first thing that happened was this losing jobs in retail, leisure, hospitality, health and education services. These are jobs done in person. Millions of people were temporarily sent home. In May, I think partially in response to strong public policy coming out of the CARES Act and other bills that were passed to try to support people during the pandemic, recalls began and the gender gap in unemployment began to narrow. But state and local layoffs began disproportionately harming women. And of course, the elephant in the room the whole time was childcare. Women dropped out of the labor force in large numbers in September as they struggled to balance work and childcare. So I think of this as really coming at a point where we've had an incomplete path to gender equality. So let's think about how gender roles in families have changed over time. So here we can go way back to that 1950s, and you can see female labor force participation in this blue line. Roughly a third of women were in the labor force. And that rose to a peak in the late 1990s. Now realize these are people ages 15 and up, and part of what's happening is our population is aging. And so we sort of peaked out in the late 90s, and that we now have this sort of challenge that we want baby boomers to be able to retire, and we want them to survive, and that's going to keep overall labor force participation down, but that's not the only thing that's going on here. So we see labor force participation really stalling out, and it stalls out in the early 2000s in a way that doesn't happen in other countries in the world. So even though I mentioned this idea of thinking about the fact that the population is aging, the stalling between, say, 2000 and 2008 is not what we see in other countries. In other countries like Australia, where they're introducing paid maternity and paternity leave, where they're increasing childcare subsidies, you see women's labor force participation continue to rise. You see that in Europe. And one of the things we saw in the US is we slipped in our OECD ranking quite substantially in the 21st century in terms of female labor force participation. So we see everyone's, labor force participation really taking a steep hit coming out of the 2008 recession. As you can see, men's took more than women's, and we can sort of focus in here on the 21st century. And you see that, men were leaving the labor force to an even greater extent than women were in the 2000s. But this is an ongoing trend for men. For women, this stalling out was something really new. Everyone saw decreases coming out of the 2008 recession, but they were steeper for men than they were for women. And you can see this upward trend that happens in the sort of from 2015 through the end of 2019, as women's labor force participation really starts to recover and men's continues to flatline. And again, you can see this a little bit better if we zoom in. But now let's look at what happens with the pandemic. Everyone's labor force participation drops, men's starts to recover, and we've seen that recovery flatline for men. We see something very different for women. Something a lot of people have talked about is the decline that happened between August and September as women realized that school was not coming back in person. And we haven't really seen much of a recovery from this decline, what we might think of as a school year decline. So now let's think about how family life has changed. This graph shows the percentage of people married at every age in decades starting with 1880 and going through 2015. And what you see, I think the very first time I ever saw this graph, the thing that really struck me was marriage rates in 1880 looked a whole heck of a lot like marriage rates in 1980. There's a slight difference. You can see that at young ages, there's some slight differences, but actually, if you look at the 1900 and 1980 lines, they're both sort of a reddish brown, and the real differences don't come till sort of later in life, when you see that, in 1980, not surprisingly, we have a lot more longevity, and we see a greater share married over about age 50. But otherwise, these lines, up until around age 50, these lines track each other quite well. What are the outliers? So the outliers are to think about 1960. So 1960, you see something very different, which is this hump moves all the way up here. People married at really, really young ages in the 1950s. So by the time you get to 1960, we have a greater share of people under the age of 35 married than we'd ever had before, and that we've ever had since. What is that different in 2015 and 2000, although 2015 continues this path even further, is now we have the opposite movement. We see fewer people married in their 20s and 30s than we've ever seen before, even in their 40s. But we see more people married post 65 than we've ever seen before. So I think of this as a golden age for marriage in the golden years. So marriage is not something that's disappearing. It's something that's becoming postponed, put off, and becoming a greater part of our older years. And you continue to see these kinds of patterns where people are eschewing marriage when they're young and tending to marry slightly later in life. And this also is one of the reasons why we've seen just a more thriving second and even third marriage markets, is there's just a lot of people who are dating and thinking about marrying in their 50s. So now let's think about what happened with having babies. So you can see my little GIF moving and showing you a hump from 1980 to 2016, a flattening out, where you see the age of first mothers really shifts from the 20s to the 30s and 40s. And this is all mothers, not mothers of a certain education gap, but all mothers. And people are just having their kids at older ages. So here you can see that, we still have some women having their kids in their 20s, but actually there's sort of even a lull in the mid 20s. And then we see this sort of big jump back up in the late 20s. And we see more weight, more mass, even though they're not the majority, all the way out here in the late 30s and 40s. This is a trend that has continued over the last 4 years. And here you can see it with some data that shows that 22% of women ages 40 to 44 in 1994 had become moms as teens, versus 13% who were that age in 2014. Women who were 40 to 44 in 1994 were 14 points more likely to be moms by age 24 than those in 2014. By their mid-30s, both groups of women were about equally likely to be mothers. But then look at this, by age 44, you see the women who were 40 to 44 in 2014 were slightly more likely to be mothers. So you can see this pattern where, based on 90% in 1976 of women ages 40 to 44 were mothers, and that declines to a low of 80%, but rises up to 86% by 2016. This is what I mean when I say fertility is recovering. Women are back to having more kids. They're doing this by having those kids at older ages. You can also see that they're having more, there's two things going on, more likely to have ever given birth. So there are fewer women who've had 0 kids, and they're actually having more kids. So these are mothers at ages 40 to 44, and the number of kids they're having after hitting a sort of low of 2.34 rises to 2.42. Some of, if you look at all women, you see a bigger increase from 1.86 to 2.07. This comes from the fact that there are more women who would in the past had 0 who now have 1. Once we condition on only people who have 1, you also see some of this is coming from people having more kids than they used to have. So here we have fertility booming. And then we have women in educational ascendance. And this is something that we've been watching for the last 30 years, where women are choosing higher education at much higher rates, and they're outperforming boys in the classroom. Nearly 3/4 of girls attending high school go straight to college at either a 2 or 4-year school. Male high school graduates are 10 percentage points less likely to do so. There were 137 female graduate students for every 100 male graduate students in 2017, and women earned 53% of all doctoral degrees in 2017. Put this in context, women earned 10% of doctoral degrees in 1970. There's a stock flow thing here you need to think about that I think people often overlook, which is that if what we're thinking about we're thinking about is, all these women are getting educational degrees, that still puts them in, when this sort of pattern starts in the 90s, these are still people in their 20s. The vast majority of people in the workforce with a lot of experience in their 40s, in their 50s, that have higher education, that have a lot of experience, they're all male. But now we've had 30 years of this. So as we enter the pandemic in 2020, it's not just that women hold the majority of jobs. Women are now the majority of college graduates in the workforce. And it took us several decades to build up that stock so that now, if we look at workers with a college degree, people in the labor force with a college degree, the majority of them are women. And this has been a trend that's taken some time to come. But I think it's also one reason why the pressure of the pandemic blew up at a time in which women were much more integral, important, essential part of the workforce. And you can also see this in median job tenure, where men used to have more job tenure. Men would have 6 years of experience compared to women's 4 years of experience with the same employer. And that's now collapsed, where men and women have very similar experience in any given job. Earnings have increasingly become concentrated among college educated. And I think this is actually an important part of this story, particularly if you think about what people call the K-shaped recession, how college educated folks are doing okay, gender issues aside, and the challenges of parenting aside, whereas the real income challenges are at the bottom. You see this in the stark data of earnings rising. Earnings rises have been disproportionately among people with a college degree, but among women, we've actually seen increases in earnings for people with a high school degree or some college, where we've seen losses for men with those educational. So when we put this together, women's equality, increasing equality in the labor force has meant more paid work, higher earnings, shifting to new occupations, particularly previously male-dominated occupations, less part-time work, more moms doing paid work, more dads at home. To put this in perspective, the growth in women's paid work was responsible for about 1/5 of the growth in real GDP in the 1970s and 1980s. Much of the growth in household income in the 1980s and 1990s was driven by rising female wages. The focus on stagnant wages arose as women's labor force participation growth stalled and women's wages began to stagnate. So I like to think of it as women's ascendancy in the labor market papered over some of the challenges with inequality in the 1980s and 1990s, because even as men were struggling in the bottom sort of 2/3 of the labor force to maintain any kind of wage growth, their wives were having wage growth, and that was leading to rising household income. U.S. female labor force participation has declined while it continues to rise internationally. So what kind of insight does economics give us to these changes? So as I said, I think there's a lot here, more than I can talk about in sort of my remaining 5 to 10 minutes. But I want to think about a couple aspects. So economists think about why people form couples. So I say why marry. I think marriage, legal marriage or not legal marriage, isn't really the question. The question is, like, why form a committed partnership with someone? And economists, if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, very famously, economist Gary Becker proposed that a big motivator was production complementarities. He justified the idea of the separate spheres in the household. Woman will take care of the household while her husband will bring home an income. And this is through specialization. Households are producing more together than singles can produce apart. Many economists have also alluded to public goods, goods like televisions that you share in the household. And you can think of children as public goods as well. I think it's also important to think about consumption complementarities. I may enjoy television more if you're watching it with me. I may enjoy our children more if I can share that joy with you. That comes from the pleasure of consuming together. And in a lot of my work, I've argued that what we've seen is a shift of motivation from production complementarities to consumption complementarities. And that's been really important to actually preserve family formation as much as it has been preserved, because those production complementarities that we used to get in the household are now superseded in many ways by the market. So think of this as our old model of marriage, specialization between home and work, where we get these production complementarities. And the key to specialization is that there are benefits to having one person do it all rather than splitting the job among two people. That means one person who specializes in laundry can do more laundry in an hour than two people each spending 30 minutes would do. I once tried to do my laundry on an old-fashioned washing board, and I believe in specialization in that kind of laundry. With my current machine, which tells me exactly what cycle to put it on and what's going to happen, and I just push a button, I don't think we're getting very many gains from specialization. That's sort of the issue. So returns to specialization for sure exist, but they vary according to task over time and may not exist in such broad categories as market work versus homework in today's modern society. So let's think about the important changes that led to that. So we've had an enormous amount of legal changes that happened in the last century. We have an Equal Pay Act. I think sometimes people forget about that, but that's been in place since 1963. We have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act from 1964. We have Title IX of the Educational Amendments of the Civil Rights Act. We have divorce laws changing the nature of bargaining within families. And we have the Supreme Court decisions giving all women the right to access birth control, the right to seek an abortion, and legal rights to children born out of wedlock. We seem to be continuing to argue as a nation over abortion or birth control issues. But an important set of legal rights in this era was the right to recognize children who were born out of wedlock. And I think one of the most striking Supreme Court cases to me, the case where there was a clear wrongful death. The children had brought a case against the company that had led to the death of their mother. And the company said, of course we were responsible, but who are you? You're children born out of wedlock. You have no legal standing. You are not related to this woman in any way. Everybody acknowledged she was their biological mother who had given birth to them, but having been born out of wedlock, they had no legal recognition. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said, we need to end this. This is not a good policy. But the state argued in fact that why they needed this kind of policy was to create incentives for children to be born within marriage. So this idea of public policy serving to create incentives is always sort of underlying many of these decisions. How did legal changes impact the growth? There is a very large literature which shows that laws directly related to employment increased women's options to work outside the home and increased women's engagement in paid labor. But other laws change the incentives and returns to working outside the home, and the literature has also shown that they played a role. So Title IX's applicability to sports gave women access to participate in sports, which created a set of skills for women, which led women to enter male-dominated occupations and increased labor force participation. Similarly, divorce law reform does not change divorce per se, but does change the amount of time women are likely to spend in marriage, increases women's labor force participation. We can think about technological developments, the development of appliances that substituted for skill in the home. We can think about increased trade, reducing the cost of goods that were substitutes for home production. When I was a kid, my mom made clothes. It was cheaper. Now it's cheaper to buy garments that have been imported from abroad than it is to actually make them yourself. Making them yourself is crafting. It's not cost savings. Societal changes change the benefits of marriage. So taken together, the benefit of specialization fell. The opportunity cost of specialization into non-market work rose. So women's opportunities outside the home rose. So what we saw was less work in the home, more work, market work, decline in marriage, and a shift in importance among these benefits of production-based marriage to consumption-based marriage. So that gives us this new model of marriage, which I think we're all really familiar with. And the picture up in the left-hand side of sort of the morning chaos and everybody doing their part now to me looks even nostalgic, because I welcome the idea that I'm trying to get the kids outside of the house, as I'm sure many parents do as well. But it's this idea where everybody's working and everybody's helping with the kids. And what this has strong implications for marriage, and given sort of the time constraints, I'm going to skip some of this and just sort of run to what it kind of means. It means that couples spend more time together at work, at play, and they spend more leisure time with their children, which is something we see in the data. We see fathers are now more involved parents. But what we saw was public policy in the 1960s responded to changing public opinion by creating a set of policies that further shaped both families and work. The result, I think, unintended, but the result was to encourage marriages of equal gender roles where both people work and take care of kids. And in marriages where both people work, parents are more likely to raise kids who enter marriages of equal roles. So these interactions reinforce and continue the trend. The challenge is that we've been stuck with workplace norms and public policies that were designed for households in which one person is responsible for all things outside of work, raising children, taking care of aging parents, waiting for the cable installer, etc. And yet that's not what our families look like anymore. And that's where I think the crash of the pandemic exposed this incompleteness of the revolution. We need to accept that we no longer have a stay-at-home parent and a work-for-pay parent, but we have households where both people are trying to do all things. Equality in the workforce helped create equality in the home, and equality in the home helps to create equality in the workplace. We need to be addressing both what's happening in the home and what's happening in the workplace. We also have seen that policy can impact marriage in very unexpected ways. Increased free trade reduced the benefits of having a specialist homemaker and reduced the need to marry. You know, I've seen China blamed for a lot of things, but not blamed for increasing marriage rates. But yet I think that increased trade from China has helped reduce the need for people to marry. It's reduced the incentive that comes from production complementarities. But it also helped propel marriages of equality. Technology replaced much of the work of housewives. These work, family, consumption goods are all intertwined, and the pandemic has exposed the incomplete transformation and created an impetus for change. Will women end up with a smaller role in the labor force, or will the labor force adapt to allow more women to return, is the big question of 2021. Workplace policies like workplace flexibility, paid parental leave, worker training, increased access to education. These are policies that have been shown to increase female labor force participation. They also increase marriage rates, fertility rates. The United States failure to offer sick leave, paid sick leave and paid parental leave is one reason it's fallen behind other countries in female labor force participation and fertility and marriage. Policies to increase worker productivity may increase marriage by increasing the returns to marriages of consumption complementarities. And I will end by saying that, in way back in the early 2000s, I met with somebody in the Bush administration who was convinced that what we needed to do was to take income away to create incentives for people to marry. And I said, no, it's having income that increases the incentive to marry. It's not the opposite. And so as we're considering a bunch of policies and we're thinking about the incentives, what I hope you take away is the idea that one of the motivators for marriage is for people to have the time, the space, and the income to enjoy each other's company. And when people are short on time and income, it actually makes it hard to keep a successful marriage together. So I will end here and stop sharing my screen.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Betsy. This is Jay Shamba, co-director of IIP with James. I'm going to quickly turn this right over to our two discussants who we have with us here today. First up, we'll have Eiko Strader, who is an assistant professor of public policy, women's gender, sexuality studies, and sociology at GW, and does a lot of research and teaching on social inequalities. And following Eiko will be Mary Ellsberg, who's the executive director of the Global Women's Institute at GW, a leader in public health and women's rights research and advocacy. And so that's kind of in keeping with the theme of this seminar series, to have people with different backgrounds coming in to discuss what I thought was really a fantastic presentation by Betsy. I've heard Betsy talk about some of these topics before, but I always learn something different each time, and I thought that was terrific. So I'm, without delay, going to turn this now over to Eiko, and with one last thing being to say to everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I'll be monitoring those, and after the discussants are done, I'll bring some of those questions to Betsy and to the discussants for a discussion at the end. Eiko, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess technological issues are just name of the game during the pandemic, but so thank you for really interesting presentation. As a sociologist, I was thinking about conversations that I used to have with a feminist economist that I had on my dissertation committee, Nancy Fulbright. It was but anyway. So, we tend to think about these changes focusing on women, especially married women, and their, changing roles in the society and then labor market. But, why do you think we spend less time thinking about changes among men? Policies impacting men, workplace culture impacting men. Why do you think we continue to, think about these issues from the perspective of married women?
Oh, is this like, is that, I didn't know whether you were asking that rhetorically or you wanted me to get to.
I thought that I was supposed to engage with you.
Okay, no, that's great. That sounds fun to me. So I think that's a great question. And I think that we should be thinking about it from the male perspective. I think, or on what it means for men, sort of two things. One, Jay's actually also thought about this issue. Nobody really can understand what is going on with prime age men. It seems like every time we turn around, they're working less and less and less and less, like until they're gonna, at some point, right, they're just not gonna work at all. And here's the thing that's really the kicker: they're not at home doing productive things at home, right? And this has, led people to speculate the problem is that video games have gotten too darn good. So they're just having, like, men are having the greatest leisure time of their life. So I think there are really important questions about what's going on with men in the labor market. And I didn't present this data here, but I have presented it before, and I know Jay's seen me present this before. Men are more dissatisfied with work-family balance than women are right now. And that is, I think one of the reasons why we'll get change. And I think It's really important, though, that we start thinking about this as the change that parents need, not the change that women need. So I, I think the idea, some of you may have seen someone calling for a Marshall Plan for moms. And I think that that is really engaging, but really terrifying to me, because I don't want to be the only parent. I tell you what I learned in this pandemic, I don't want to be a single parent. I enjoy having a partner, and I want him to do his half, not his 10%, not his 20%. I want him to do his half. And so, I do think we need to be thinking about what kind of policies are needed to generate that equality in the home as well as equality in the workplace.
Yeah, because I just feel like we are. Can everybody hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So I just feel like we are thinking about all these historical changes, but and then the theories are always thinking about family as a unit. But somehow when we say family, we somehow put more time into thinking about women's roles in the family than less time on what men are doing, inside a unit. It is true that we are recovering and having more kids, but that doesn't mean that the men are fathering less kids or anything. They're fathering as many kids as women do. So I just don't understand why we somehow think about these work-family issues from the perspective of, only women and not from men. It's a continual issues for me, because I started getting into studying about work-family issues, thinking about women. But then the more I studied about women and identifying all these, policies that are supposedly helping women, but what are we doing with these policies to men? And it seems like it's one of those habits in the, in the field that we just tend to forget about men. So it was one of those things that I wanted to discuss first as I was listening to your presentation. I'm sorry, I thought I was supposed to quickly ask a question because I was told about 5 minutes. I'm like, 5 minutes, I guess I can ask one question. So I'm like, I have to share questions so quick, but.
Okay, well then, why don't we bring in, unless, Eiko, did you have something else you wanted to raise now, or should we bring Mary in? Okay, so then, Mary, I'd like to turn to you for any comments or thoughts you have now.
Sure. Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
So thank you for really a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot from it, and also from watching, I have appreciated the many articles and interviews you've given recently, calling for policies that are taking childcare and the care economy much more into account. And I've noticed that most of the analysis you've done, if not perhaps all of it, has been based on the United States. And at the Global Women's Institute, we've been paying a bit more attention to the impact of the pandemic on women globally. And so I had a couple ideas, things that have come up from World Bank and UN Women data, and would love your thoughts also on how, what you think is similar and different. And some of the issues that are not all economic, but certainly have economic implications. One of them is that globally, and particularly in low and middle income countries, women are also located in the same sectors, service sectors that are affected by the pandemic here as well, and loss of jobs, but also women really dominate the informal sector. And a point that has been made by the World Bank and by UN Women is that these are sectors that are much less supported by social policies. So they don't get the kinds of unemployment benefits, sick leave, or other benefits that might be covered either by Social Security programs or by the social protection nets. And so that's a big area of concern. Also, that women tend to have, not only do they earn less, but they have less savings, they have less, they're more likely to have single parent households and have less ability to recover from these kinds of economic shocks. So again, I don't know if this would be also true here, or is that something that's a little different? And then, since you were mentioning fertility, that is a big concern to women's rights activists globally, that The pandemic has either diverted resources or made it harder for women to have access to contraception, diverted resources from maternal care, so that we are likely to see, first of all, many more unplanned pregnancies, but also maternal mortality and other kinds of issues affecting women's mental as well as their physical, sexual, and reproductive health. So that was another area. Another area affecting girls disproportionately, the argument has been made in terms of school and school closures. Of course, you have in your writings and interviews have talked a lot about the disproportionate impact on mothers in care of children and homeschooling, and how many women have had to drop out of the labor force just because of their care duties, but also the impact on girls themselves of school closures, and girls also playing more of a part in caring for younger siblings, for elders and sick people within the family. So they may be also likely to fall farther behind in terms of schooling than the boys. I've heard discussions of the digital divide and where there might be only one cell phone, for example, for a child in a family, for a child to keep up with remote schooling, that in many countries might be more likely to go to the boy than to the girl. So there's that whole side of girls falling more behind, and this is in a context where they're already behind, unlike in the United States, where girls have really made so many advances in terms of education. Another piece of that we've seen, for example, from other crises in Ebola, is that girls are less likely to rejoin school after the closures end. Many of them are going to end up either in caring for families, or we're also seeing an increase in child marriage, and some of that is for also economic reasons. And in our research in South Sudan, for example, we found that the economic crisis caused by the conflict meant that many families, as a way of regaining wealth that was lost through the crisis, were marrying their daughters off earlier and earlier. So this would be particularly in societies where bride price is practiced, and that's actually that's an important way of wealth building. So increases in FGM, in child marriage are also foreseeable or already happening. And then a final point, which has to do with, which has been discussed a lot, is intimate partner violence and violence against women and girls in general, as a result of being in households for two reasons. One is because as a result of crises, economic crises, and any kind of humanitarian crises, we see increases in domestic violence anyway. But what's particularly devastating about this particular crisis is that women have even less access to services than they might have otherwise. They're more likely to be enclosed in a place in tight circumstances with their abusers. And globally, we're seeing about a 30% increase in calls to helplines, to shelters, and at the same time, public funding and resources for these kinds of services is decreasing. So that's one thing that I think has been really important about the Secretary General's reports on the unequal impact of the pandemic, and calling services for intimate partner violence part of the essential services that must be given additional funding during the pandemic. Let me see, I think those are kind of the main points that I was seeing, and I think some of them mirror what you've been talking about in the United States, and some of them look pretty different. And so I'm just wondering if you could sort of react to that, and does what I'm saying resonate also for what we're seeing here? Now over to you.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important point that there are some really different things going on in the developed country context and in the developing country context. And, we've been, I think, focusing in the US so much on the idea of a K-shaped recovery internally to the United States and less on the fact that it'll be a K-shaped recovery globally, most likely. And not K-shaped recovery, meaning that we'll see developed countries recover more quickly and with fewer sort of long-term implications than we might see in developing countries. So, you know, when the I took some notes on some of your points so we could touch on some of them. So, like, one issue is fertility. You know, access to birth control internationally. This is a really big issue, right? If you're thinking as a government, should I buy some birth control or some vaccine? They're going to be buying vaccine, and the fact that there might be trade-offs there, and creates its own set of problems. If you put this in like the developed, now let's put it back in the United States or even in Europe, what they're seeing is a decline in unintended pregnancies because nobody can go to the places where you tend to go, where you would interact with somebody that might lead to an unintended pregnancy. So I know I initially thought that we'd get a huge baby boom out of the pandemic, but I think that that's proving to not be true. And it's, you know, remembering and in the United States, 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. Not all unplanned means that they're with a new partner, but a lot of them are with, you know, new partners that you meet in some of the ways with things being shut down. So I think
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to add with that one, when the pandemic started, I'm a knitter, and I started immediately knitting baby sweaters, thinking that there will be a huge demand in a year. And now I've got this huge glut of baby sweaters and nobody to use them.
And no babies. Yeah, so it turns out that I think within couples who are living together, there's nothing like a pandemic to kill the mood. And when it comes to having to meet new people, that all that stuff's been shut down. So we haven't. I think that this issue of access to birth control, you know, that's not a developed country phenomenon, but it is very much a developing country phenomenon. And there also the ways in which, you know, there's also pregnancies are much more likely to be occurring inside of marriage because of the fact that marriages are more of an economic relationship. It's that production complementarities, income unifying sort of older style of marriage is much more dominant in the developing country context. You know, there's a bride price, and men are hoping to get somebody who comes in and does work for them, you know, cleans the house and raises kids. And so I do think the fertility is very different. You also pointed out the impact of school closures on girls. Again, I think there are very big differences between the developing and developed country context. As you mentioned, in the developing country, there's already a huge divide. If you have to prioritize who's going to come to school, it's often boys. Girls are expected to do, you know, caregiving work. I don't know enough about what's happening in the developing countries. You know, some of the work that can still be done is going to be the kind of work that boys do. So I don't know if that will ameliorate some of that. If you turn to the US, I think I'm much more worried about boys than I am girls. So it is true that girls in the household may be being given, you know, look after your sibling, help your sibling with their Zoom school, take this responsibility or that. But girls have always done better. And this is one of the reasons why they've done so well in the classroom, is that sit still in your chair and do what you're told. Girls have been a bit stronger at than boys. And so if you're putting boys and girls in front of laptops with very little supervision, on average, I think the girls are going to learn more in that scenario than boys will. And I think that that's going to be a challenge. I mean, in general, I think all kids are going to have some challenges adapting as we go back to school. And, you know, I don't know how the gender breakdown is going to shake out. I think what I'm more concerned about when I look at girls today is I'm more concerned about teenage girls that are watching what can really only be described as a shit show, sorry for the language, but in many households. And, you know, whether they see that and think, oh my God, I never want this. And if they think, I never want this kind of chaos, I never want this kind of stress, does that lead them to think I won't have children, or I will scale back my career ambitions? And I don't know what that younger generation, what they're going to see. I also don't know, I think what we're seeing is a lot of women right now who are passing up, a lot of women in their 40s, passing up opportunities for promotion, stepping out of the labor force, stepping back in some way, just as they were about to show younger women, oh, this is how we take on leadership roles. So what, you know, it's taken a long time to get women who've had that experience that they can start shattering glass ceilings. What happens if there's less glass ceiling shattering happening than we were expecting? How does that affect the women who are looking up at those women? And I think those are big open questions that we both will need to study, and some of it will be time will tell.
Thanks, Betsy. I wanted to encourage the audience once again, if you've got some questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I wanted to first ask you one quick question, first directed to you, Betsy, but if Mary or Eiko want to hop in, I'd love to hear their thoughts as well. But when you talked about the consumption versus production-based kind of thoughts around marriage, I'm wondering if one of the things we're seeing, to your direct points you were just making, is in some sense the pandemic shifting back towards a production one, in the sense of, well, we can't outsource cleaning, we can't outsource childcare, we're not outsourcing as much cooking because we're not eating in restaurants. And if it's forced a shift back in that sense towards more of a production model, and I guess it made me think to something I've heard you talk about in the policy world, which is the question of on-ramps and off-ramps. And the on-ramps we would need to get people who have left the labor force because of that switch back into the labor force once kind of things go back to a different type of world.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think that is a lot of what's happened. I mean, you know, some of that change that coming from technology, coming from market development, coming from trade, is that, you know, we didn't need as much specialization. And partially that might mean, I mentioned like washing machines, we could take turns. I don't need you to do all the washing. There's not a ton of expertise that comes in having only one person do it. But there is some things where, you know, we, you know, in cooking, if you're getting takeout, there's not a ton of expertise in who stops to pick up the takeout. But if you're actually cooking meals, then you can start to develop, you know, then I think there are real returns to specialization. And I think households I think instead of trying to figure out how to manage full-time work with sharing a lot of those household tasks, a lot of families relied on outsourcing, meaning not outsourcing in a way that they necessarily thought of as outsourcing. So I've talked a lot about, like, you should, you know, hire people, but I think a lot of people have this discomfort in hiring people, but then you realize how much outsourcing they were doing because they didn't hire a person, but they did stop and pick up the takeout. That's hiring a cook and a meal prep person, just bundled in a slightly different way. They did stop and drop off the dry cleaning, which is, you know, they did have a cleaning service come through. You know, they had a lot of services that allowed there to be less negotiation at home about how you're going to split those tasks up. And so I don't know that a lot of these tasks have come back with great returns coming from specialization, but I do think that they have made us confront the fact that if we're going to do these together, how are we going to split them up? And the negotiation, you know, economists, when we think about things, we often just like assume what we call frictionless bargaining. We'll just decide. and anybody who's ever been in a household knows that there's not that much frictionless bargaining that goes on over who's gonna do household jobs. There's a lot of friction. And I think, you've definitely read stories about families where the friction in bargaining over who's going to deal with kids, who's going to deal with cooking, has led one parent to say, I'm just going to do more of it and we're going to scale back. And I think one of the articles that annoyed a ton of people from this summer was a woman who was running her own company whose husband was unemployed, and she still scaled back because her husband couldn't take the ego hit of stepping up and doing the work. And her family was falling apart with the no childcare situation. So I think that's the sense in which we need to think about the incompleteness of the gender revolution. What is going on with men? Back to Eiko's point, what's going on with men that when this guy didn't have any work, he still couldn't deal with like taking care of the kids who were at home. So we are definitely switching back to more production-based, division of tasks, marriages. I don't know that they will be stronger for that though. And I think that's what's really important. Marriages that are based on consumption complementarities in our modern day are strong. Marriages that are based on production complementarities when there are real returns to specialization are strong. But marriages based on this kind of household specialization, when it's being based on an inability to have those negotiations, I worry are not strong. So I think the answer is complicated.
Yeah, and another thing is that I think because marriages are usually based on similarly educated husband and wife, so I think the problem is that when they're trying to outsource, we're looking at families who are highly educated and higher income, they're trying to outsource, versus low income husband and wife who cannot outsource. So during this negotiation, I think inequality between households are also increasing as we are trying to address gender inequality. So then we have to start asking questions, who's doing the even outsourcing? We often hear about, highly educated wives trying to find their nannies, trying to, order groceries on their apps, still doing the outsourcing work. There's gender inequalities associated with outsourcing behaviors. And then as technology advances, highly educated husbands are benefiting more from, less time dealing with the fundamental issue, I think. So alongside including men to conversation, I think we need to be thinking about between household inequalities, by class or education that might be also increasing right now. It's like
yeah, I think this issue, and we haven't really talked about it, and I've seen some people in the Q&A have raised it, but there are really important distinctions within developed countries like the United States in two-person married households with 2 college graduates and households with people with less education, many of whom are single parents, many of whom had their kids at younger ages. And as a result, 1 in 6 kids in the United States is growing up in poverty. So you have, we're failing kids, we're failing parents, we're failing moms. And that's where the strong public policy response needs to be, because we, as a government, we are supposed to represent not just the people who are old enough to vote, but I think government's supposed to represent the people who will grow up to be able to vote, regardless of what their parents want, right? So when we think about, childcare and early childhood education, this isn't actually just about parents. It's really about investing in those kids and giving them the foundation that's necessary, right? We don't provide K through 12 education just for parents' sake. We provide it because we think that it allows kids to grow up. Well, the time we came up with the idea of K through, to grow up with more skills, the time we came up with the idea of K through 12 education, we mistakenly thought that under 5, before you can learn to read, you're not really learning important stuff, so we don't need any formal education. now we have decades worth of research that shows that's actually the most important brain development time, and more structured, pedagogically oriented, doesn't mean you're teaching reading, but pedagogically oriented early childhood education has huge impacts on people's skills as adults. So, you know, that's about investing in the kids. But I really want to say something that's important about the pandemic and lower income women is that a lot of times people think about things like, well, people have lost raises, they've stepped back from promotions, they, you know, they've lost where they are in the career ladder as being about high education women. It's also about women with less education and lower income jobs, and it's perhaps even more tragic there. I did an interview with Michigan Public Radio recently, and they interviewed this woman who had started at a job at a minimum wage, and she'd worked her way up to around $15 an hour. And she talked about how much easier her life was to manage at that higher wage. She finally felt like she had some breathing room. And then when she had to leave the labor force, when she lost her job and wasn't able to work, you know, when she not only lost that income, but when she comes back, she's probably not going back at the same wage. She's going to be back, maybe even starting from square one. And that, you know, when you're on the bottom of the ladder, falling several rungs on the ladder, super painful. And so this is about women all among the ladder, falling several rungs down. And what are we going to do with public policy to help get them back up?
I think actually that last question is the one that a number of the questions in the Q&A kind of have a similar view, which is trying to ask really all three of you, you know, if you're thinking of one or a handful of policies, whether it's in the US or globally, to try to make sure that the pandemic recession does not leave kind of an indelible mark on women's labor force participation, what is it you're looking for?
One thing I think we haven't tried, but we should, based on what Scandinavian countries are doing, we need to reduce the work hours men put in. I think we need to, you know, asking the question, what does a good worker look like? Do you really need to work 60 hours a week? Probably not. I think we need to be thinking about reducing everybody's work hours, maybe work, you know, work family conflict a bit more manageable, but first putting cap on how many hours supposedly available men are putting in. I think that's one solution idea that I feel like maybe we could be learning from some of the European countries, you know, reducing weekly work hours.
So I think Mary highlighted, you know, women's access to healthcare, including birth control. And I think that that is important globally. It's also because women work in those jobs. They work in those jobs. They need the care. They need access to birth control. They need access to being able to have healthy pregnancies. So making sure that we continue to globally fund access to healthcare is going to be supportive of women in just a number of ways. So that to me is incredibly important. I think that every country should have access to paid maternity and paternity leave. And almost every country in the world except for the United States does, surprisingly, even, you know, developing countries. So it's a real anomaly that the US doesn't have that. And we need to realize that childcare is about investing in children, and it is as important for the economy as the, you know, as I've said in many interviews, as the airlines. Congress has no problem in the United States tripping all over themselves to make sure that we don't lose our banks or our airlines, important things that they see of as fundamental to the structure of 21st century market economy. Well, I think that childcare is as essential as the banking system, as essential as the finance system, as essential as the airlines. And we need that to be at the top of the mind of the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, the President of the United States, that childcare matters. We don't recover from this pandemic if we don't invest in the people. And that is, investing in the people is really about, I think starts with access to high quality, affordable childcare. Mary, you're on mute.
How about now? Okay. Thank you. One other piece that has been really emphasized by UN Women is, so on one hand, mitigation of the current impact of the pandemic and really making sure that women in the informal economy are also getting access to the social protection measures, and really talking about getting cash into women's hands, either through cash transfers or the other kinds of social protection programs that might not be benefiting women who are in the informal economy. And then as prevention, continuing to work on getting girls into schools, and of course improving access to contraception. All of this is important in terms of being able to keep girls in schools. So those are a few of the other issues that I think are also very important globally.
Betsy, a few of the other questions that have come in, I think I could summarize them by saying they're asking you to kind of drill down into different angles. So instead of the overall arching position, many women, especially women who are parents, have faced, but so kind of differences we're seeing between parents of teens versus younger than teens, or differences we're seeing for single moms as opposed to women in a two-parent household, things like that you're seeing.
A lot of the challenges are with single parents, and I think there's that big New York Times coverage. I think a lot of the media is very obsessed with the women who have who seem to have, I guess I would even say, options, and that's married women or women with with more education, so who are in I don't know if you want to call them high-powered careers, but higher paying jobs. And the real rock and a hard place these women are in, but I say options because they're making choices. Some people bristle at the word choices. Their choices, they're not being given good choices, but they do have options. And I think when you look at single women, there are not a lot of options. There's no choice about whether you can leave your 6-year-old at home alone to do Zoom school while you go to your in-person job at a hospital. That's not a choice. I think a lot of these women have left the labor force out of necessity. I think that's why they'll be back. I think when their kids can go back to school in person, they will go back to work. And I think to compare it to previous times and say, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, this is what people did when they had this sort of access to income. I mean, I very much strongly believe that if we give families with kids at the lower end, particularly single moms, if we give single moms more money through, say, a fully refundable child tax credit, it actually makes it easier for them to work, and that they would like to have a higher standard of living. I don't think it causes them to sit back and say, well, we're not going to starve to death this month, so therefore I don't need to work as much. I think these women, they are the ones we're seeing drop out at really high numbers. Now, the other thing that I've seen is that September drop was really concentrated in women 35 to 44. And that's because I think related to that fact that we saw more women having kids in their 40s than we'd really ever seen before. And so, if you're 44 years old with 3 kids under the age of 9, you might think this is more than I can take while you're working. But when it comes to thinking about, let's talk about the group of women that Mary raised, like women in the informal sector or women who are working in lower wage jobs. One thing I think people don't understand about our unemployment insurance system is that If you earn too little, you get nothing. So I think one of the most frustrating things I've ever seen is it is literally possible to have fully paid in to unemployment insurance, because in many states, you're only taxed on the first $7,000 of your wages. So earn $7,000 in a year, fully pay the tax that somebody who earns $70,000 pays. So you and that person's employer has paid the same amount, and yet you, because you're low wages, don't qualify for any benefits, and that higher earner does when you lose jobs, right? That's the craziness of our unemployment insurance system. With the CARES Act, Congress recognized that they needed to be able to help a large number of people, and they really expanded the safety net by saying, okay, even if you are a part-time worker making $300 a week, normally we wouldn't give you anything, but this time we will. We should always be giving that person something. People who are working part-time, a single mom working part-time making $300 a week needs unemployment insurance more than just about anybody else I can think of. Why is that the person we're excluding from the system? And then similarly, we have never included people with informal work arrangements. So we often think of that as our gig employees. So think about somebody working for TaskRabbit or Uber. This is also people who are self-employed. You might have some mom who's working from home, who's managing to take on a little bit of work, and that's how she is managing childcare and workplace flexibility, is through self-employment. That's the only way she can balance all of her childcare responsibilities as a single parent, and we don't give her unemployment insurance. And so again, the CARES Act expanded that. I hope what we learned through these expansions of the CARES Act is it's time to reform our unemployment insurance system so that we're covering all sorts of people, including people who tend to be in more vulnerable work situations.
Great. We're just about out of time. So I want to thank everyone for adding questions in the chat or comments. Actually, I think somehow or another we managed to get to many of those questions by touching on them in one direction or another. I wanted to see if any of our panelists had any last comments they wanted to make before we wrap things up. Seeing no one raise their hand.
I guess I'll just say thank you for this opportunity to present and to engage with Mary and Eiko. It was really nice talking with all of you, and I think I'll end by saying, I feel very optimistic coming into 2021 that we have exposed a bunch of problems that have remained hidden and in the shadows for too long, and so we're going to solve them. So that when Madeline thinks about having kids, all these problems will have been solved, and it will be a much easier situation for her to navigate.
On that very optimistic note, I just want to say a sincere thank you to Betsy for joining us from Australia today and presenting all these thoughts. I thought it was a terrific presentation and a great discussion. Thank you very much to Mary and to Eiko for joining us, for bringing their perspectives as well.